The wind carried the smell of dry sage and the faint memory of rain as Calder Boone rode in from the south, a lone figure crossing the wide gold of a dying afternoon. Dust clung to his coat, his hat brim shadowing eyes that had learned not to linger on anything they couldn't keep. Tied to his saddlebag was the last of his money, 12 crumpled dollars, and in his chest, an emptiness that had followed him farther than any outlaw or debt. The auction in town had been brief and indifferent. No one cared about the ranch on the edge of nowhere. Its roof sagged like it had been holding its breath too long. Its fences leaned as though they'd been drinking. Folks called it cursed. Calder didn't care for talk of curses. A man already carrying his own ghost didn't need to fear someone else's. The only bid was his, and the hammer fell with a hollow knock that seemed to echo longer than it should have. Silas Crook, leaning on the porch rail of his general store, squinted as Calder rode past. "Throwing money in a snake pit, Boone," he called. Calder didn't answer. By the time he pushed through the groaning gate, the sky was brushing itself into dusk. The air shifted, warmer, heavier, as though it knew he wasn't alone. He swung down from his horse, boots crunching the brittle earth, and stepped into the shadow of the barn. Something moved inside, not the restless scurry of an animal, but the deliberate stillness of a person watching. Then she stepped forward, bronze skin under the pale light, hair tumbling in dark waves over her shoulders, dress worn thin but mended with patient hands. She stood like the barn belonged to her, like the land itself might rise to defend her claim. "This place is mine," she said, voice low but carrying, shaped by the kind of certainty that can't be faked. Calder's hand found his belt. Not the gun, just the leather, steadying himself. "Paid for it this morning," he said. $12 and a handshake. Her eyes didn't flicker. "The law is just paper in a white man's pocket," she replied. "I paid for it with exile." He didn't know her story, but he knew the weight in her tone. The silence stretched until he stepped back and let her pass him in the doorway. She didn't leave, just moved deeper into the shadows, as if retreating to the bones of the barn was all the answer she needed to give. By the next day, the town had heard. Calder felt it in the way Mrs. Talbot tilted her head when he walked into the store, eyes narrowing in speculation. Silas leaned over the counter, selling him nails and flour, his words thick with warning. "Ain't wise keeping her kind on your land," he said. Calder just counted out coins and left. The whispers followed him out the door, crawling under his skin like burrs. The days that followed moved in an uneasy rhythm. She stayed mostly near the barn, slipping into the cottonwoods at dawn and returning with bundles of herbs or a basket of small, knotted vegetables from a hidden garden behind the barn. Calder worked the fences, mending the gaps, replacing boards eaten soft by years of wind and rain. They spoke little, just enough to trade small necessities. A bucket of water left by the barn door. A loaf of bread set on the fence rail. It might have gone on like that if not for the evening when voices, slurred, mocking, cut through the quiet. Calder rounded the barn to find two young men from town, whiskey-breathed and grinning, crowding her back against the wall. One had her arm in a grip too tight. The other laughed like cruelty was the joke he'd been waiting to tell. Calder's voice cracked the air. "Let her go." The laughter faltered. The man holding her sneered, but Calder was already moving. The fight was quick and hard, the kind where there's no clean strike, just the thud of boots in dust and the taste of copper in the mouth. When it ended, the men limped off, cursing one spitting blood. That night, for the first time, she came into the cabin. Her leg was scraped raw, bleeding where she'd hit the ground. Calder knelt, pulling a strip of clean cloth from a drawer. She winced but didn't pull away as he wrapped the wound, the warmth of his hands against her skin almost startling in its gentleness. She didn't know him her story, but she gave him a fragment anyway. She had been banished for helping a white man escape a debt to her people, branded a traitor, though she had only been saving a friend from a noose. He didn't tell her, but he believed her. He'd been accused of worse. The firelight between them felt like a fragile thread tying two exiles together. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin walls, and inside, for the first time since he'd come to this land, Calder felt the faint, unfamiliar pull of wanting someone to stay. The last light of the day caught in her hair as she leaned against the weathered white boards of the barn, her head tilted back, eyes closed in exhaustion. Calder knelt in the dust, his hand steadying her leg, the smell of earth and blood heavy in the air. Somewhere beyond them, the prairie stretched quiet and endless, holding its breath. Sheriff Amos Greeley rode in 2 days later, the morning sun glinting off the badge pinned to his vest. He didn't waste words. Sitting straight in the saddle, he looked at Calder like a man who'd rather not be here, but would still do the job. "She goes Boone," he said, his tone flat. "You keep her, you're in violation. Fine'll be heavy. Might be jail." Calder leaned against the porch post, arms crossed. "Land's mine. Who's here's my say." The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then shook his head slow, like he'd already written the ending to this story. When he rode away, the dust followed him like a trailing thought. That afternoon, Calder found the garden behind the barn torn apart. Plants yanked from the soil, stalks broken and left to wilt in the sun. The earth was kicked loose, like someone had danced through it just to leave ruin behind. No footprints clear enough to claim, but Calder knew. Marisol knelt in the wreckage, her hands brushing the torn leaves with a care that made the sight harder to look at. She didn't cry. She never did. Instead, she began picking through the damage, salvaging what seeds she could find. Calder crouched beside her, scooping soil back into the beds. They worked in silence, the sound of their hands in the dirt louder than any words. When they finished, the beds looked rough but planted. It felt like a small rebellion. Two people refusing to let someone else's hate decide what lived here. A week later, the sun was folding itself toward the horizon when Calder heard a sharp, high cry. He ran toward the barn, his boots kicking up clouds. Marisol was on the ground, her dress twisted around her knees, blood streaming from a deep gash along her leg. Above her, the same two young men stood, one holding a knife still slick, the other grinning through a split lip from their last meeting. Something in Calder snapped. He slammed into the nearest man, the fight exploding into splintered wood and grunts of pain. The knife clattered against the barn wall. Fists met bone. Blood hit the boards. The second man lunged at Marisol, but she kicked him back. Even his pain bent her forward. By the time Calder drove them off, they were limping, cursing, promising they'd be back. Dust swirled around them, curling at his knees as he knelt beside her. His hands pressed to the wound, the blood hot against his palms. She leaned back against the weathered white boards of the barn, her head tilting upward, eyes closed in pain. The sky above was painted with the last flush of pink and silver light, the air heavy with the smell of dust and blood. That night, Calder didn't let her argue. He carried her into the cabin, set her down on his own bed, and stoked the fire until the room glowed. He made broth, wrapped her leg, and sat nearby as she slept. When she woke, she caught him watching her, not with pity, but with something quieter, harder to name. 2 days later, the sheriff returned. This time, he brought Silas and the two battered men. They stood in a half-circle at the porch, the sheriff's hand resting on his revolver. "She leaves Boone," he said. Calder stepped into the doorway, shotgun balanced on his shoulder. "She's not leaving. Not today. Not ever." The words hung there, heavy. Silas muttered under his breath. The men shifted, restless. The sheriff's gaze held Calder's for a long beat before he turned his horse. "Your funeral," he said, and they left, but the promise to return was in the way their dust lingered. That night, the promise came due. Firelight flared in the yard, the smell of pitch thick in the air. Calder and Marisol were already awake, waiting in the shadows of the barn. The men came with rope and flames, but the fight that met them was not the one they expected. Calder's rifle cracked the night open, the report rolling across the prairie. Marisol moved beside him, bow drawn from some hidden corner of her past, her arrows striking with a speed and certainty that sent the men stumbling back. The fire caught in the grass, but died before it reached the barn. When it was over, the yard was littered with the groans of retreat. The men fled into the darkness, leaving only the smell of smoke and the sound of the night slowly returning. By dawn, the air was soft again, smelling faintly of wet ash and the first breath of morning. Marisol sat on the porch, her leg wrapped in clean cloth, her hair loose, catching the breeze. Calder brought her a tin cup of coffee and sat beside her. Neither spoke. They didn't have to. Something had settled between them, not in words, but in the quiet certainty that this place, this patch of earth, was no longer empty. The prairie rolled away in every direction, endless in gold. But for Calder Boone, the center of the world was here. Sometimes the world tells you who doesn't belong. Sometimes it's wrong. Folks will try to burn down what they don't understand. But if you stand your ground long enough, the fire passes, and you find yourself left with something worth keeping. A home is not the wood, or the land, or the deed. It's the hands that hold you up when you've been knocked to the dust. Remember that when the world turns its back, one soul, standing with yours, can make the loneliest place feel like the center of everything.